Ocean sunrises and sunsets are scenes that I've painted quite a number of times before, but I've never really described my process in detail. And so in today's video, I'm going to show you how I'll go about recreating this photograph by Josh Friedman, whereby the sun is rising over the Atlantic Ocean, and as it does, it peaks from between these two palm trees while enriching the whole scene with all these vibrant colors. This time I'll show you my painting process alongside the part of the photograph that I'm referring to, so you'll better understand my line of thinking in every step. My painting measures 80 by 100 centimeters, and so the first thing I'll do is to subdivide it into equally spaced grids, and so I'll calibrate each section in intervals of 8 so that I end up with equal rectangles all through the canvas. I've drawn a similar grid on the reference image so that in the next step I'll copy on the canvas the way the main lines or the main contours in the reference image interact with the grid. I'm using oil paints to paint these outlines, but the grid that I started with was drawn in chalk. I use different materials for this so that when I'm done with the outline stage, I'll be able to erase the grid without interfering with the outlines. To make the paint runny enough to enable me to paint such lines without having to reload the brush all the time, I mix it with a solvent, and the solvent I'm using this time is kerosene. Kerosene is toxic though, so when using it, it's important that the studio or whichever area the artist is working from has good ventilation. But it's a very effective solvent, and it's not only useful when it comes to thinning paint the way I've done for this stage, but it's also very handy for cleaning brushes. The plain grey background behind everything here is an acrylic layer, and I painted it on top of a silk vinyl primer whose main job is to block the pores that normally appear on raw canvas. The acrylic background, however, is optional, and I only use it because I don't like painting on white surfaces. A neutrally colored background like this enables me to appreciate different colors and different hues and levels of lighting more accurately than I would on either a black or a white surface. To get rid of the grid when the outline is ready, I wet a soft brush with water, then gently brush it across the surface, whereby the water will wash away the grid that's drawn in chalk, while sparing the outlines that were painted in oil paints, since being oil-based, they are not miscible with water. This next step is also optional, and this is creating the underpainting. This is a simplified monochromatic or one-color version of what the final painting will eventually look like, but it's painted with very little detail, and its purpose is for it to guide the next step in the same way that the outlines are guiding it, except while the outlines were guiding the proportions, the underpainting will guide the contrast, and so it will be easier for me to know which parts of the painting should be light or dark, as opposed to if I was just painting directly on the canvas with the outlines and nothing else on it. Not that it's a big struggle, and actually in my later paintings that I'm working on at the time of recording, I don't really use the underpainting anymore, but to be able to surpass that step, I had to use it quite a lot, and so in this and other paintings, you'll see how I make use of it. The underpainting, just like the background before it, is painted in acrylics, and the main reason why I use acrylic for both of these stages is because acrylic dries very fast. This is a preliminary step in the painting stage, and so I don't need to spend, or rather I wouldn't want to spend a lot of time on it, which makes acrylics the most convenient type of paint to use for it. The caveat when it comes to using acrylic is, of course, because it dries so fast, it means you also have to paint really fast, because it doesn't give you the time to keep blending paint over and over on the surface. And so some of the transitions that will eventually be cloudy or smooth in the final painting will appear quite rough in this stage. I generally use hard brushes in this stage because given how heavy acrylic is and the way it sticks to the bristles, it can be quite damaging to soft brushes. And with acrylics, even as I paint, when I'm resting a brush or when I'm changing brushes, I rest them in a container of water just so that the paint doesn't dry on the bristles and becomes difficult or impossible to get rid of. The colors in the underpainting are also muted, so you won't find me using black or white in their pure form in this stage either. And that is so that in the final painting, if I'm going to have sections that will be as dark as black or as bright as white, it will be very easy for me to tell which parts I've painted on and which parts I haven't, if the underpainting underneath doesn't have those extremes. The color that I use for the underpainting as well is usually one that won't show up in the final painting at all, and so if you see I've picked a brown or a purple monochrome, it's just because that way it's easier for me to distinguish parts I've painted on and parts I haven't painted on later on. Some years back I used to paint the underpainting pretty much in full color, and so even though eventually I made it work, I still made my life a lot more difficult at the time because I really had to squint through the underpainting to make sure what I was looking at was oil and not acrylics, and so that's why over time I've simplified it into a simple monochrome. With the underpainting done, it's time to paint the sky, and so in this stage I'll start by mixing all those blues, greens and yellows that will give me that vibrant morning sky. I'm using oils from this point onwards, since from now on I'd like to use as much time as I need to blend in the colors or manipulate them on canvas as much as necessary. The masking tape is there to protect the section where the ocean starts or where the horizon is, so the colors of the sky don't encroach into that section of the canvas. And I've also drawn some simple lines in chalk that will roughly show me where I'll stop painting certain colors in oils. My general approach when painting a scene like this is to start with what's farthest away from us, and in this case that will of course be the sky. And so I'm laying in all those individual colors that form it that I mixed on the palette earlier. Then afterwards I'll come in with a soft brush and blend them all in to create a smooth transition from the blues at the top to the yellows and oranges at the bottom. I'm painting the sky here to cover the entire upper section, including where we'll have the leaves of the palm trees, since it will be easier to paint the trees on top of that sky as opposed to isolating the sections where the sky will be visible through each and every space between the leaves. Of course, this makes the outlines that I started with earlier on kind of useless because I've covered them all, but these are decisions that I make as the painting goes along. And so starting with one thing doesn't necessarily imprison me or imprison the artist through the rest of the process. It normally helps to give yourself the freedom to change things as the painting progresses. In any case, after painting the sky, I'll then use the same process that I used earlier on to mix the colors of the clouds. And as you may have noticed, I like to arrange my palette quite neatly, so it's easy for me to know where each color is. The sky doesn't have to be dry by the time I'm painting the clouds, since I'm using pretty much the same colors as the ones I used earlier. And I also want them to blend in to each other, at least at the tops, so that I have, no pun intended, but this cloudy transition as opposed to a hard edge. It would still be doable if I allowed the sky to dry completely, and there are cases where I still do that. And this is when the colors of the sky are so different from that of the clouds, and I don't want any contamination between the two. This time though, I'll paint the sky and the clouds in one sitting. And for the clouds, I'll paint the brightest colors last, which is the exact opposite of how I did it with the sky. The reason why I started with white when painting the sky was because I was going to use the same brush to paint the yellows around it and the blues above it. And I wanted the brush to be as clean as possible when painting the white section, and so I opted to start with it. With the clouds, however, their brightest peaks will be a derivative of the colors of the clouds themselves, and so the brush doesn't have to be squeaky clean, which makes it possible for me to start with all these other colors without being anxious about possibly contaminating the highlights. When the masking tape comes off, you can see just how clean of an edge we now have. And so with this, I can be able to paint the ocean immediately without having to erase any paint that might have encroached into each section. As opposed to how I did it with the underpainting, this time I can go to both extremes. So you've seen that in the sky I've used white, and in this case for the ocean I'll be able to use black, although I don't really use black in its pure form in my painting, so the dark color that you're seeing on my palette to the left is actually burnt umber. Still, it's much darker than the darkest color in the underpainting, which makes it very easy to tell, like I said earlier, with the parts that I've painted on and the parts I haven't painted on with oils. In the section close to the horizon, and especially close to where the sun is rising from, the water will appear kind of yellowish or orangish. And so I'm starting with these colors since they are closer to the colors I've just used for the clouds above. And I want to use the same brushes without cleaning them thoroughly at this moment. And so I'll first finish those off, then start painting the blue, or in this case the green, that will make the ocean. The water wasn't meant to be green, but I somehow got carried away when mixing and kind of misread the colors. And so in my palette, whilst I thought I had mixed something that was closer to blue, I'd actually mixed something that looked more like grass. And so hopefully the reflection of the bright sky and the waves will eventually make it look more like water and less like a field. The general process I'm using here is to put the colors side by side into what's normally known as a vector painting. Then afterwards use a soft brush to blend in the transitions so that the colors appear to easily flow into each other. With oil paints, this doesn't have to be done in one sitting since it takes some time to dry, but it's still advisable to do it this way because different colors have different drying rates. And so if I wait for say a day before I come in to blend these colors, the darker colors may dry before the brighter ones by the time I come back, and so I'd have to repaint them once again, then finally blend them all together. Anyway, with the local colors of the water painted, now it's time to paint the little waves and ripples that will make it look ever so slightly turbulent. And for this, I'll start with the shadows of each wave, first with the bigger or the more obviously visible ones, then later on with smaller ones. And this will add a sense of movement and three-dimensionality to the water that we didn't have before. I'm doing this before the local color or the green underneath dries completely, since if I let this background dry before I do this, then the soft brushes that I'm using won't be able to create these unbroken lines, and so I'll either have to repeat each wave individually or I'll have to coat the entire section with some linseed oil, which will then soften the surface enough to paint these lines as though I'm painting them on wet paint. There's no reason to put myself through all that though, since I can just paint these lines before the green local color underneath dries. When I'm satisfied with these shadows, I'll then start painting the highlights on top of each visible wave, or at least the main ones. And these are what will make the surface of the ocean have that glassy or that liquid feel, as opposed to how it is right now. The dark shadows I've just painted gave it that sense of movement, so it doesn't look like a flat field anymore. But now to make it reflective, this is where the highlights are going to come in. Some warm highlights that are kind of yellow will also appear in the section right underneath where the sun is rising at, and on top of some of these I'll also show some brightest highlights which are going to be white. Still going on with the theme of painting what's farther away from us before painting what's nearer. Now that the ocean is done, I'm going to start painting the beach in pretty much the same process as I've done the ocean, and just as I've done with the sky and everything else, the colors are also going to be warm in this section thanks to the way light gets scattered during sunrises and sunsets, and of course the way Josh edited his picture. The general approach here will be to start with the local color, then follow that with the shadows, and eventually the midtones and highlights. And so with this process I'll show the textures where the beach is at all the way to where the palm trees are in front of us. Then afterwards it will be time to paint the trees themselves. By the time I'm painting the trees, the sky and the ocean behind are completely dry, and so there's no risk of me either damaging the paint underneath or smudging it, or impurifying the color of the trees by having it mix with that of the sections behind the trees. And for the leaves, since I already painted over the outlines I started with, I'll start by sort of recreating something close, this time with the color of the leaves themselves, after which I'll fill up the sections that are completely blocked with the flat color that the whole tree will generally take up in this light. I'll then use smaller brushes to paint the individual leaflets. At this stage I'm not focused on any of the shadows, but just to get the general shape down, and it takes a couple of passes for me to make them look as clean and crisp as they do at this stage. But in any case, when I'm satisfied with this, I'll then start painting the shadows. And these are going to be the foam shadows, or the shadows that the leaves or the tree trunks will cast on themselves, and not the drop shadow, which is the shadow that the whole tree will cast on the ground. After this, I'll show some highlights, then it will be time to paint that section where the sun was shining through the trees. Given the complexity of the section, I've subdivided this section of the tree trunks into 3 concentric ovals, then used chalk to draw some lines that will guide the way the light will seem to radiate from where the sun is. And so with the background dry, I'll start by painting these soft rays of light. Then I'll paint each ray individually from color to color in a way that simplifies the gradual transition from the white in the middle all the way to the end of each ray into a selection of 3 or 4 different tints. The step after this, as you can probably guess, will be to try and blend them in so that we don't have those hard edges. After which I'll now start painting the tree itself, but in a very similar fashion, starting with the brightest stream of light around the white sun, then following that up with a gradually darkening palette, until finally, as we get further and further from the light source, the color can then seamlessly blend into the dark maroon that formed the tree trunk in the first place. Before blending all these colors in, the whole section looks like a dartboard, but this is nothing that a soft brush and a bit of patience can't fix. Creating this effect has been the most challenging, or at least the most mind-engaging part of this painting, and so it's been very pleasing to have wrapped it up in this neat way. What's left now is the lower section of the trunks, and I'll paint this in pretty much the same way I did the section above the sun, while blending the local color and the shadows in with the sun rays in the middle of the trunk. Finally, on the trunk to the right, we're going to have a few more rays coming in from the puddle that's reflecting the sun. But since this isn't as complex as the one in the middle, I can just paint it in a few coats before the color of the trunk dries. With that, we now have ourselves a complete painting, and side by side with the original photograph, you can see the similarities and differences. The main difference, in my view, being that the waters appear darker and calmer in the painting than in the photograph, and the colors are a bit more saturated in my painting as well. But these are variations that different artists will make based on their styles. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed this process, and if you might have any questions about it, feel free to leave them in the comment section. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.